Reddit, what's your family's darkest secret? Not safe for work. My mother was a groupie for Creedence Clearwater. There's 5 kids in my family, and none of them know who my older sister's biological father is. We all like to speculate about it, except for my mother and older sister. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no millionaire son. No. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't no fortunate one. No. Before the day's end of Ancestry.com and whatnot, my cousin and his wife went to Ireland with idyllic intentions of tracing our family heritage. They never spoke of it again until years later when they admitted it repeatedly dead-ended at mental hospitals and jails, and they got so discouraged they quit. Yeah, Ireland doesn't have a particularly happy history, I'm afraid. My grandparents swapped spouses. My grandmother on my mother's side had an affair with my grandfather on my father's side. Everyone got divorced, and then my grandfather on my mother's side fell in love and married my grandmother on my father's side. Family reunions were fun. My head hurts thinking of the potential drama and complications this can and has caused. My great-grandmother went out to dinner with her husband one night. Her husband thought she was looking at other guys and brought her to a hotel room nearby and slit her throat. He left her to die, but she survived and then escaped and left him. We didn't find this out until a few years ago through an old newspaper. I was like, okay. What the heck? Shit escalated quickly. Turns out my grandfather had been molesting my aunts as kids and the other female cousins of mine. Finally, one of them mentioned it to her husband, and he called him and said, either you turn yourself in or I'm calling the cops, or something similar. Now, my grandpa is in prison. Totally out of nowhere for me too. He also said that if more victims came forward, he wouldn't deny it. Mostly pissed that if you really think about it, he got away with it. He's in prison now, sure, but he was already dying. So just now on his deathbed, he finally goes to prison for what he did. Also pissed that no one in my family seems to care, and they're all trying to make excuses for him. Yep, my grandfather molested his daughter, which is my aunt, and everyone just acted like it never happened. My own parents even left us alone with him when we were young children. It was only when I found out that I put a stop making excuses for him. The child he molested and one of his sons still see him, but I can't control other people's decisions. My dad's family is messed up. His cousin told her husband that if he didn't stop smoking, she'd divorce him. So instead of quitting, he lied about having cancer. When he went to the hospital, he told her he was getting treatment, but instead smoked at the hospital. This all happened before I was born, but yeah, her husband lied about having cancer for almost a decade. My dad is the only normal one in the family. One of my aunties was a very, very ill woman, like oxygen to get out of the chair. Going upstairs is a 1-week thing if lucky, and her son is a prick. When she refused to pay his drug debt off for the nth time because she had no more money, he poured petrol all over the house and threatened to burn her to death. The fumes were enough for her to pass out. He panicked, took a handful of pills, then panicked at the decision and called himself an ambulance. Didn't even mention his mom. Police turned up with the paramedics, arrested him, and took her in the ambulance. I disowned him instantly. My uncle was apparently in prison for a couple years for sexual assault. No one ever spoke of it, and I didn't find out until after he suddenly died years later. He suffered from schizophrenia, and when his wife left him after years of refusing treatment, he wandered off into the woods and froze to death. Now we don't talk about either of those things. Edit. Oh, and my father only has 1 testicle. The other one never descended, and my grandmother either didn't notice or was too embarrassed to take him to a doctor about it. My family was smuggling diamonds in the Apeldoorn area of the Netherlands from the late 1800s until World War II. They pretty much got rich off it too until the Nazis invaded and took most of them into concentration camps. My great-grandfather, while on the trains to a camp, convinced himself and several others to jump from the trains. As they did, they were gunned down by Nazi soldiers, and my great-grandfather was one of the only survivors. How rich are you now? My mom's parents were uncle and niece. Her dad married his brother's daughter. Their family was on the East Coast and they ran away together to California. They had 2 kids, my mom and her older brother. All of us are a product of incest. As long as your mother married outside the family, you're fine. My grandfather's uncle fell in love with an underage girl. He got drafted into the war and had to leave. When he came home, he found out she had died. He dug up her grave and kept her dead body in his bathtub. We just don't talk about it, and I've never met that side of my family. Edit. First off, holy shit, I did not expect my comment to take off as much as it did. I went to bed and woke up this morning to 1 million emails. Secondly, I called my mom to see if I can get some answers to all of your questions. Turns out the guy was actually my grandmother's cousin. He was a Marine in the Korean War, and apparently when he got back, he was told that she had died. My mom has no idea how old she was or what she died of, however, and he became so distraught he went up and dug up her grave, put her in his bathtub, and kept trying to revive her. He was discovered only a couple days later, and my mom says it was in a small town, and once her freshly dug up grave was discovered, they just put two and two together. No one talks about it, only my mom, obviously. Cradle to the grave robber. My dad is abusive and keeps my mother in debt so she can't take us and leave. We look like a perfect middle-class family from the outside, but boy is it shit on the inside. I grew up like this. Eventually I was tired of seeing my mom get beat and no one was doing anything. Also, I had kids of my own now and wasn't gonna watch them suffer as me and my siblings did. A few years ago, my dad was just giving my mom a killer week, beating her senseless. It went on for days. Finally I left. Packed my kids up, dad was beating my mom in the garage with music turned up so no one would hear her screams, and drove down the street and called the police. I was shaking. This man had raised us not to ever speak about the abuse, ever. Well, I betrayed my dad and called anyway. Testified in court against him, hardest fucking thing to do after 20 plus years of abuse as well, and he got 10 years in prison. He gets out in 2023, but we got away. For now. I don't really think that this is a dark secret, but it's something that I didn't find out until I was an adult, which was most likely because my grandma doesn't like talking about it. So I think it still counts. When I was going through some old stuff of my grandma's after the death of my mother, I found some old photographs of a baby. Not my mom, because my mom had dark, almost black hair at birth, and this baby was blonde, and a birth certificate for someone named Francesco, my mom's maiden name. I asked my grandma about it, and at first she didn't really want to tell me, but I gave her some space and she must have decided that I deserved to know, or maybe that she was just tired of having the secret because she eventually told me. Francesco, who they called Frank, was my grandma's son. He was also my mom's younger brother by a couple years. Apparently, when Frank was 3, my grandma's ex-husband kidnapped him and my grandma never saw him again. My grandmother's ex-husband, my grandfather, although I don't consider him such, the least reason for which is because I never met him, was involved in the mob and is suspected that he took Frank with him back to Sicily, but nobody is really sure. My grandma is pretty sure that he would have taken my mom too if my mom hadn't been sick and in the hospital due to tonsillitis at the time. It's kind of given me an idea why that side of the family can be withholding about things. I didn't know my mom had been married before my dad until I was a teenager as well, but it also makes me feel really sorry for my grandma. My grandfather died in 1946, before my dad was ever born. We were always told he drove his truck into a ditch while drunk, fell asleep, and asphyxiated when the tailpipe got clogged with mud. He was in his early 30s at the time. Well, I got into genealogy a couple years back and found a bunch of records and newspaper articles about the incident. Turns out, my grandpa wasn't alone in the truck. He was with an underage girl, less than half his age, who also died alongside him. Obviously, this wasn't my grandmother. The newspapers didn't say explicitly, but there was a heavy insinuation that there was some side-of-the-road romance happening when the fumes apparently overtook both of them. I still haven't told my dad what I found. Not sure I ever will. Just because my dad hasn't mentioned it doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't know. My uncle was investigated for the Green River killings. Years later, he was investigated for the Spokane prostitute murders. He was good friend with Yates, who was found guilty, and his saliva was found on a beer can near a dumping site. When I was a little girl, my mom told me to never get in his car if he tried to pick me up. Funny enough, he sells life insurance. What was your uncle doing that made him get suspected of being every serial killer in the Northwest? Laughing out loud. My granddad was into dating students before it became something people lost their job over. That's how our family got started, he taught. Then he gave extra credit to my grandmother. What was the age difference? My great-grandma claimed for a long time that while she was a virgin, which was why she adopted my grandmother, but I later found out she had multiple miscarriages. I don't know if that qualifies as dark, but it's definitely sad. Rest in peace, great-grandma. That sounds tragic, actually. My grandfather raped and abused my mom and my uncle throughout their childhood. My grandma covered it all up and he never went to jail. They lived next door to us. Jesus, how do you cope with it? My great-grandmother ran a brothel. Great-grandfather was murdered by brothers who decided they were both in love with my great-grandmother, and great-grandfather was in the KKK. The KKK was quoted in the newspaper as saying something like, "We take care of our own." The brothers were never seen or heard from again. Edit. Brothers were two siblings, unrelated to my family, and not members of the KKK. I don't know how they planned to divide time with my great-grandmother. Also, when my great-grandfather helped lay out my great-grandfather for burial, 9 bullets fell out of my great-grandfather. Well, goddamn!
Watch our other videos and subscribe cause you're not a scrub.